Welcome. I'm David Healy, and I'm going to be talking about healthcare or health services. Now, these words probably sound almost identical to most of you. Two words that describe the same thing. They're not. There's a world of a difference between the two, and this is probably the most critical political issue of our day, at least as important as climate change. Let me begin here with an x-ray of my left shoulder. This is about 5 years ago. I slipped in the shower one day and broke it badly. There's bits of bone here that are in all sorts of places that they shouldn't be in, and I was kind of fortunate that they didn't interfere with any arteries or nerves or whatever. Later that day, this was a Friday morning, later that afternoon, I had a plate put on my shoulder that put things right, and I was able to get back to work the following Monday morning. This was good for me, obviously. It was also good for my family and friends. It was good for the patients I was seeing who didn't have to see a completely different doctor and explain their problems to him or to her. It was good for the organisation, for the hospital that I work for. They didn't have to hire anyone else to do my job for a few weeks or a few months. It was good for the university I work for because I was able to keep going with the research I was doing. This was good all round. And healthcare, when it works as well as this, healthcare can be delivered for free. This is healthcare. A few weeks later, I had a great example of health services, and it's in this letter here, which most people over a certain age, anywhere in the Western world or developed world more generally, will get after they have a fracture. It's inviting me to get my bones screened to see if there's any bit of bone thinning that might have contributed to the fracture. And if there is, I'll be offered the option to take a drug to thicken up my bones, a drug for osteoporosis, a bisphosphonate drug. Now here's one of these drugs, or an advert for one of these drugs, and these appeared during the mid-1980s. And the advert again suggests that this treatment is going to be good for this woman, it's going to be good for her family and friends and community. It's going to suggest that using these drugs will be cost effective, that all sorts of other things that could go wrong won't go wrong if you just use these drugs. This looked to be the case from the controlled trials that brought these drugs on the market. So the guidelines, which have begun to come into medicine at this point, recommended treatment with these drugs rather than trying to tell the person to get fit. The companies that make these drugs provided machines to scan bones for free to pick up any little bit of bone thinning, because they knew if there was hints of bone thinning that their drugs were an answer to the problem that the machines had caused. And because hospitals had free machines and the guidelines recommended these treatments, they put screening programs in place to ask people like me who'd had a bone fracture to come along and get our bones screened. But the programs didn't work out quite the way people had thought they would. There wasn't a reduced rate of people going on to have fractures. The drugs themselves could cause problems, and this meant we put auditors in place to try and monitor what was actually happening, and then managers in place to try and make sure that a service which should work and should be good for everyone actually did deliver the goods that people thought that it should deliver. There was, however, in this group of drugs and this group of patients a get-out clause, which is, well, they're aging. This is just one of the consequences of aging. At the end of the day, there's not much we can do about aging. Before I pick that one up, though, I want to show you this. This is an image of a spiral fracture of the femur. This is the kind of fracture that we didn't see before this group of drugs came along. It didn't show up in the clinical trials of these drugs because you have to be on bone thickening drugs for a few years before things like this happen. The problem with a fracture like this is that it often cannot be repaired properly at all. And it's not that this kind of fracture, this unusual kind of fracture, was one of the things these drugs can cause. In fact, the drugs didn't reduce the rate of fractures, any kind of fractures, at all once you had access to the full clinical data from the trials that were done. We didn't have access to that data. The other thing is that these drugs cause other problems. They cause people to have acid reflux and a range of other problems, which means they have to take drugs to handle those. So you've got to take drugs to treat the problems that the bisphosphonate drugs are causing. And this all causes the costs of drug treatment to go up. But the key thing is that the companies were able to claim, well, the costs of drugs aren't rising more than you'd expect because they're still the same fraction of the overall healthcare budget that they've always been. And the reason they're the same fraction is, well, we've employed a lot of other people to deliver the drugs. So the drugs are always going to remain around 10% of the budget, even though they're causing problems rather than reducing the problems that we're trying to manage. And this comes back to the aging point, which is exactly the same thing is happening in children's mental health as is happening in the treatment of osteoporosis in people over the age of 50. This is an image of Bart Simpson from some decades back saying, "This is the worst day of my life." And he's being comforted by Homer, his father, at a time when we didn't put children on antidepressant drugs at the rate we're putting them on them now. And Homer's offering a wisdom that it's terribly difficult to see people being able to offer now. Just like it's not clearly a wise thing to be saying to women who have some bone thinning, don't take drugs, go out and get fit instead. In the same way, we're finding it harder to say to kids, look, this is life. You've got to toughen up. And a few years ago, Jeremy Hunt, who was then the Minister of Health in the UK, said that children's mental health is possibly the biggest single failing of the national health system in the UK. Now, he said this despite the fact that at that time, and even since, more and more money was being poured into children's mental health service, with screening programs in place and guidelines saying take the antidepressants, but things are turning out worse and worse, so we have to put auditors and managers and others in place to try and grapple with something that's spinning out of control. Why are things spinning out of control? Well, let me introduce you to a ghostwriter here. Ghostwriters in real life don't look like this. They're usually women who've got PhDs, who are excellent at writing, who know how to handle data, who know how to write up the results of controlled trials. And sort of almost all the literature on patent drugs is written up these days for the best journals in the field by women like this. This is a page from a document I got hold of 20 years ago, looking at Pfizer's SSRI antidepressant Zoloft. It's a 50-page document or so looking at the trials that have been done on Zoloft in people who are depressed and people who are anxious, people who had social phobia, people who had OCD, young people, old people, mixed with other drugs, the economics of giving Zoloft. And here's one page in that document on the trials being done for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And over on the right-hand side, you'll see that 2 trials have been done. They're actually both negative if you get to see the raw data, but they're going to be portrayed as this drug works wonderfully well for PTSD. And the 2 trials are going to go to the very best journals in the field. Over on the left-hand side, you see it says author TBD, to be determined. The academic names that are going to go on the authorship line of these articles haven't yet been picked, even though the articles have been written. The academics are going to be picked based on who the marketing department in Pfizer figures would be the best names to put on these articles for marketing purposes. These articles are not about science. They do get built into the guidelines which say we should use these drugs for PTSD. The academic authors whose names end up on them and the ghostwriters who write the articles don't have access to the data behind these trials. They can't see that the trials were negative. They can't see the hazards that have been written out of the script. And let me just have flipped off the slide for a second. Let me get back to where we were. So, what you've got here is fake news. This is a concept that Donald Trump introduced us to some years ago. The greatest concentration of fake news on earth centers on the drugs a doctor gives you, or your parents, or your children, or whoever. And it's been this way for over 20 years, probably close to 30 years now. The problem is, if we had access to the data behind the trials, which we don't, we'd have seen that the bisphosphonate drugs increase the rate of fractures, not reduce them. We'd have seen that when you give these drugs to children, where the entire literature was ghost-written or company-written, you'd have seen that actually the rate of suicidal acts in children goes up on these drugs, not down. What we've got instead within the health domain is a PR campaign run on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies, suggesting that anyone who talks about the harms of drugs or the harms of vaccines or the harms of any health services is indulging in fake news. This isn't the case. The harms are being written out of the script rather than being promoted at the moment. And this is what's causing our health care to be replaced by health services. Let me take you to the economics and politics of all this. In 1848 in France, there was a revolution. And it was the year that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, based on the revolution they saw happening, brought out the Communist Manifesto. Marx didn't invent communism. There were 100,000 communists in France at this point. And the primary stimulus to communism had come from the work of a Dr. Louis-René Villermé and others who, like him, were working in public health and mapping for the first time the injuries and ill health that workers around Lyon and Paris had, working in factories producing silk and other clothes and cloths and goods that we were beginning to get for the first time. Villermé also was concerned not just about the injuries that the workers in factories could have, but the depression of wages that these factories were actually producing, which meant the people weren't eating properly, and the ill health they ended up with was as much, he thought, a result of the depression of wages as it was of the injuries that workers were getting from being in the factory. The communists decided after the revolution in 1848 that France wasn't the kind of country that was going to embrace communism, and they emigrated to the United States instead. Coming back to the Communist Manifesto, Friedrich Engels, one of its authors, a few years beforehand had written on the condition of the working class in England. And if you read this, it's not an economics book. It's a book about the public health of the working class, the conditions of squalor in which they were living. It was very, very much the same as the work that Villermé was actually producing, and that a range of doctors around the world, in England and New York and Germany, were also producing at the same time. The main German name was Rudolf Virchow, who came out with the wonderful phrase that politics is nothing more than medicine on a grand scale. Virchow was a liberal, where Marx was a communist, but both shared a vision of the state withering away. In healthcare, it's difficult for the state to wither away completely, and this became clear after World War I. You see a picture here of George Henry Newman, who was the first chief medical officer in the first Department of Health in the UK, and he's writing to the Minister of Health, the first Minister of Health, and he's talking about the national garden and saying that whereas before we've been cleaning up the streets and putting sewers in place and things like that, we're now in a position to get the garden to grow in a way that we want, to have more plants of the kind that we want, and to ensure the plants we have are healthier than they were before, and we can remove the weeds. And this is what we should be doing. This kind of thinking made eminent sense. It was, however, the kind of thinking that underpinned eugenics and the kind of thinking that later led to the Holocaust, which was very much a comparable German effort to ensure the national garden looked the way the political rulers figured it should look, where the first people to be weeded out weren't the Jews or gypsies or other people like that. They were the mentally handicapped and the mentally ill. At the end of World War II, Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, appears, and this is now usually seen as the foundation stone for what's called Neo-Liberalism. Hayek's idea was we needed to get back from central planning to the kind of liberalism which we had during the 19th century, where people were just let follow their own instincts, seeking rewards and trying to avoid things going wrong. And if we just let them be free, everything would work out fine. That's maybe okay from an economic point of view, but healthcare is much more like people being on the road in cars, where you can't just let everybody do what they want to do. You've got to have some rules and some signage and in order for the whole thing to work. So, mentioning neoliberalism is the kind of thing that will cause a lot of people who work within health to turn off. This is something economics. And the odd thing about it is, when you chase economic books trying to find out just exactly what neoliberalism is, people don't really have a good definition for it. What I want to suggest to you today is actually that anyone working in health knows a lot more about neoliberalism than anyone working in economics does. And both the good things and the bad things about neoliberalism. The phrase here, you'll see repeat at the end of the lecture, picks up on the idea that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. So here's a very famous woman. This is Margaret Mead, who in the 1940s and 1950s was perhaps the most famous social scientist in the world. And here's a quote from her, which you can see all over the internet. It's easily found when you Google it. It's an inspirational quote. Lots of people like the idea. No one quite knows who she was referring to or when she came out with this quote. But Margaret Mead herself was a member of a small group of people who changed the world. This is a group that was convened around 1946 around the work of Norbert Wiener, who introduced the phrase cybernetics. Cybernetics was picking up the ideas about how computers work or think, as it were, and applying them to other fields. Now, the idea here is the algorithm, what you see in a simple form in a thermostat, a feedback loop. If the temperature goes up, the thermostat turns the heating system off to bring it back down to the range that we want. And the idea was that similar thinking underpins biology, this is homeostasis, or learning as in a conditioning theory. And the idea was to explore how far this could be extended. Cybernetics gave rise to what's called systems thinking, or a systems approach towards things, and an operational approach, focusing on doing rather than thinking. It also underpinned management theory. And it gave rise essentially to neoliberalism in the sense that This, for the first time, people who believed in the free market could say, well, this is how the free market works. If you just let people do their own thing, just like a computer, it will reliably produce the outcomes that you want. Today, when anyone hears the word cybernetics, they think computers, they think cyborgs and cyberspace. But actually, the original word was an old Greek word, kubernesis, which is the word that gives rise to government in English today. This is not a free market in a sense. It returns us to central planning. Before I pick that theme up further, in 1964, Norbert Wiener died. And he wrote a book the year that he died, a book that came out the year that he died, which you see here, God and Golem. And he said, look, we may have made a big mistake. Cybernetics is great for closed systems, but it's not appropriate for open systems which involve choices and people taking responsibility. If we let systems like this be invaded by cybernetic thinking, we risk a major disaster. And he was the first person to predict that we might be at peril from full artificial intelligence. This was 1964. The 1960s were a passionate time. And this is called well, perhaps, in two books by John Kenneth Galbraith. In 1958, Galbraith wrote a celebrated book called The Affluent Society, which outlined how we were getting wealthier and more comfortable than we had ever been before. Companies and industries were producing far more goods than we had ever had before. Everybody could now have a TV set and everything that they actually wanted. All the mod cons that were needed for the comfortable life were beginning to come in range for all of us, and we could all be tourists. 10 years later, Galbraith wrote a very different book about how we were being controlled not by the marketplace, and the situation we had in our hands was not one where companies were producing the goods that we needed. Actually, companies were shaping our wants to want what they could produce. That we were being controlled by corporations in a way that we'd never been controlled before. And he asked a question about who the people were who ran these mega corporations. We all thought, and the rhetoric said, these were entrepreneurs, but he said, no, they're not. These are people who've been through management courses. These are people who've got MBAs. And essentially, these are bureaucrats rather than entrepreneurs. Now, in 1848 in France, it was a time when we were moving from an agricultural world to a manufacturing world. Previously, 90% of people had worked on the land. By 1948, close to 70-80% of people worked in the manufacturing industries, with very few people, less than 10% of people working on the land. But as of the 1940s, things were changing, and now 70 to 80% of us work in what are called the service industries, with less than 10% working in at the manufacturing industries, and only 3 to 5% working on the land. And this is a picture of the service industries here. It shows the tourism industry and the hospitality industry and the retail industry and the insurance industry and the banking industry and all these industries that provide services to us. The fast food industry is key in all this. It also shows doctors and nurses and university people. But as of the mid-1980s, medicine and universities were not part of the service sector. And there was a good reason for this. This is to take you back to the 1960s or maybe the 1970s, and you've got cars being produced reliably in a way that they weren't before, and you can now begin to rent cars rather than buy them. You've got us all ending up with TV sets, and the makers of content. Programs were reliably providing services to us in our home. And you got the emergence of the fast food industry, which was quality food in the sense of a McDonald's hamburger, the same hamburger every single time, rather than the older definition of quality that we had, which was a good interaction or a really good meal. There was a reason why medicine couldn't be part of this world, which was medicines in the 1960s and the 1970s were recognized as being poisons, and the magic of medicine was bringing good out of the use of a poison. For managers and for insurers, this does not compute. It's not possible to manage a situation in which people are trying to bring good out of the use of a poison. This is, by definition, something for which you cannot have quality outcomes. Perhaps the person who put his finger best on what was going on during this period was Herbert Marcuse, and this is his most famous book from 1964, One-Dimensional Man. And Marcuse said, we're moving into a world of operational thinking, a world in which we do rather than think. A world dictated by numbers, where if the numbers of people going to a Disney movie greatly exceed the number of people going to a Shakespearean play, well then Hollywood will give us Disney movies rather than Shakespearean plays. And the same kind of way, where we hadn't turned to numbers in health before, we had begun to be able to measure blood pressure and measure blood glucose and measure things in a way that we hadn't done before. And these numbers were beginning to change the nature of medicine. There's an old Latin phrase, pecunia non olet, which is money doesn't smell. People who come from the left or the right of the political spectrum, they don't care about what other people think, provided money changes hands. It's a bit like sort of people actually providing arms. The people who provide arms to the revolutionaries may not believe in the revolution at all, but if the money changes hands, well, that's fine. They're not going to think too much beyond that. In the same way, numbers don't smell. And this was at the heart of the development of what's called Neo-Liberalism now, which began life being called monetarism. And it was applied first in Chile in 1976, after Allende had been overthrown. And there was great inflation there, and it seemed a sensible idea to try and put control of the money supply as one of the things to try and control the inflation rate. This makes sense, if the rate of inflation goes up, just control the supply of money and it'll have to come down. The trouble is, this became the guiding principle for the economy generally, rather than what's the state of the country, what's the state of the people, is this the right thing for us to be doing? And the experiment, the monetarist experiment, was generally regarded as having failed. Trouble is, it didn't stop monetarism, which developed into neo-liberalism, which is just that. If you have something like the money supply operating as a thermostat, once the temperature goes up to a certain point, the system turns off until it comes back down. That kind of thinking was very difficult to avoid. It was happening at the same time in medicine generally, and even in places like mental health, where you would have thought it couldn't happen, which was, it's much too vague an area. We ended up, rather than viewing the mental illnesses in the way we had before, we began saying, well, if you've got 5 of 9 criteria for being depressed, then you are depressed. Now, this was the basis for what's called DSM-3, the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which introduced operational criteria. The work on this began in 1976 also, and it was published in 1980, and has completely changed the practice of mental health medicine. Most people would say that it's wrecked the practice of mental health medicine, but there's a general sense that there's no alternative. When this came out first, the idea, it was clearly stated that, look, you might meet 5 of the 9 criteria for being depressed because you're pregnant or you've got influenza, and doctors should exercise judgment as to whether these other reasons were the reasons why you actually met the criteria. And they shouldn't just say that you're depressed because you meet the criteria. But in fact, what's happened is we've ended up figuring, well, if you meet the criteria for Asperger's disorder or autistic spectrum disorder or gender fluidity or whatever, then you have the condition. There's no judgment involved or no judgment permitted. And this is the same across medicine, where the measurements have become the disorders that we treat. And the industry know this, so they provide gadgets for free to help doctors check patients' peak flow rates, knowing that if they're low, or if they're as low as me, they'll end up being given treatments for asthma. They make it feasible to check your cholesterol levels, because they know if your cholesterol levels were as high as mine, that you'd be put on a treatment to lower your cholesterol levels. It's the same with blood glucose. If the blood glucose levels are a bit high, well, this is a problem that a drug becomes the answer to. Now, one of the best ways to bring this out is to show you the weighing scales here. And weighing scales for people got introduced in France and the Western world more generally around the 1860s. And a few years later, in 1873, in France, there was the first description of a new disorder called anorexia nervosa, an eating disorder. And as weighing scales multiplied up and began to appear in all our pharmacies, complete with plates saying what your ideal weight should be, the eating disorders increased in frequency. And as we all ended up during the 1960s with a weighing scale at home in our bathrooms so we could check our weight whenever we wanted, the eating disorders exploded. They were a Western phenomenon. They weren't happening in the rest of the world. They weren't happening in parts of the world that didn't have weighing scales. We now are at a point where our phones contain all kinds of apps that will measure our emotional changes from minute to minute or hour to hour, the number of steps we take, the number of hours we sleep, the quality of our sleep, supposedly. These things are going to, like the weighing scales, create a range of nervosas that we didn't have before, a range of disorders that we didn't have before, for which our drug, or our device, or our service is going to be the answer, because you're worth it. Operational thinking also drives how we perceive risk. As of 1970, there was only 200 academic articles where the word risk features in either the title of the article or the abstract of the article. By 1990, there were 20,000 articles in the health domain which featured risk. In the late 1980s, in politics and medicine, people like Tony Blair and others began talking about risk societies, but actually medicine had got there before the economists and before the politicians. And this is the point I'm trying to make, which is generally you'll hear talk about Neo-Liberalism with no one really knowing what that means. In fact, what we've had in line with the development of Neo-Liberalism, and in fact, more often than not, slightly before Neo-Liberalism, is a Neo-Medicalism. We are not treating heart attacks, or strokes, or serious psychosis in the way we were before. We're treating conditions that we can treat in a quality way because our drugs reliably bring down the numbers. They may kill you, but they reliably bring down your numbers. So, behind all this is an algorithm. And the algorithm, as with all algorithms, is if the figures for X are high or low, give Y, where Y is a brand name drug. This is, as the image suggests, it's an act of hypnosis. This is Franz Mesmer back in the late 18th century, putting a woman under hypnosis. Now, there are three things that can interrupt the algorithm, three things that can interrupt the hypnosis. And one of these is an adverse event on a drug. The way to, it's a bit like you're putting a person under hypnosis in a lecture theatre and someone shouts fire. It breaks the spell. The one way to enhance the spell is to say, well, for instance, if you've become suicidal on an SSRI antidepressant, this is because you've got bipolar disorder. It's not an adverse effect of a drug. It's another illness that needs to be treated with yet another pill. If the doctor or other healthcare professional buys this, the hypnosis thereunder gets deeper, because the person being hypnotized here is not the patient, it's the doctor, it's the prescriber. The other way to interrupt the hypnosis is personal contact. This is why rating scales and standardized interviews are so valued by the pharmaceutical industry, because they want to control the questions that get asked. They don't want anything to interrupt the conversation that might get the doctor or other healthcare professional seeing the problem in a different way and figuring that, the answer to this isn't a drug. And finally, the one other thing that can interrupt hypnosis is an act of judgment, is a person exercising discretion. And this is not what industry want. We don't want you to consider the idea that if the figures for blood pressure are high, that you may figure, well, look, this person, like David Healy, is just that bit older and maybe he needs a bit more blood to his failing brain, so we're not going to put him on an antihypertensive. This all came to a head in around 2002 in the UK with the new plan for the National Health Service put forward by the Labour Party. And I've got this here in order to bring out a point, which is before 2000, there was the world of private medicine in the United States and there was the world of state or public medicine in the UK, and the two systems couldn't be more different. Now the two systems are close to identical. You've got managed care in both instances, and the conditions for people working in these systems and the patients being treated is the same, where morale's going down all round, and the quality of what happens is not what it once was. And the thing that has made this possible is the fact that we have guidelines, again instituted by the Labour Party here, but based on fake news. The NICE guidelines, where they concern unpatented medicines, are based on published literature, which is fake news. And if you incorporate this into guidelines, things can only go wrong. But the key point here is the guidelines tell managers what should be happening, where before the managers had to depend on the discretion of nursing staff, doctors, and others. They don't need to depend on this now. And part of the job description of an increasing number of healthcare professionals says you will adhere to the guidelines or you're fired. This was supposed to produce quality care, but what it's produced is something more like this, where nursing staff and others who before had been just nursing staff are now becoming prescribers and able to do circumscribed jobs where the guidelines dictate what should be happening. They're operating very much like the people on the checkout counters at the supermarket who don't own the supermarket, who are just given very defined jobs. There's people walking up and down behind the checkout counters with a little bit more discretion should something go wrong, and these are the doctors. But the people running the system aren't on site at all. These are the managers, and they're just not there. But if anything goes wrong, it's not the management to blame, it's the staff who are in place. The key aspect to this for me, though, was brought out by one of my patients recently who said, when I bring my dog to the vet, my dog gets more patient-centered care than I get in health services these days. And this is the point I'm trying to bring out, which is we've lost healthcare. We've an increasing array of health services, which a bit like Pizza Hut, there are all sorts of things on the menus that are brought to you, rather than the same quality of interaction that we had before. A key moment in all of this happened a little bit before the Labour plan for the National Health Service, and this was 1991, when Prozac was in the dock about whether it could cause people to commit suicide. And the response from the company was, well, these are very sad stories, but the plural of anecdote is not data. The original phrase is that the plural of anecdote is data, and if this weren't the case, polling before a general election wouldn't work, and Google wouldn't work. In response to convincing stories about Prozac causing people to commit suicide, the company meta-analysed their clinical trials and published them in the BMJ and said, look, these trials show there's no evidence, no scientific evidence that the drug caused the problem. In fact, when we had access to the raw data, it was abundantly clear that the trials showed the drug could cause a problem. But this demonstration by the company that their drugs couldn't cause a problem changed the nature of journals. They no longer take what had been the staple of medical journals up till then, which is convincing clinical accounts of certain things happening on treatment or whatever. The drugs bulletins we used to get vanished. The harms of drugs vanished. Instead, we got guidelines based on clinical trials published in journals like the BMJ, which only tout the benefit. A trial can only focus on one thing, and it's looking at whether the drug works or not, and you could turn blue and grow feathers, and the clinical trial will miss it. The problem was, if you turn blue and grew feathers, and I'm there trying to treat you and say, yeah, I think the drug has caused it, particularly because if we take the drug away, the problem clears up, I'm told the science doesn't show this. So my job as a scientist is to interact with the patient who comes to me and try and decide what's causing the problem the patient has brought to me. And if between us we can only figure that the drug is the most likely cause, then that's the correct scientific answer. If the apparent science, the controlled trial, shows something different, the second scientific task I have is to explain the discrepancy between what I see in the patient in front of me and what the evidence seems to show. And we now know in the case of the SSRIs and people becoming suicidal and a whole host of other problems, the discrepancy is explained by the fact that the published literature is fake news, that there's no access to the trial data. And when we get access, we see actually the science, the controlled trials, support what the patient has been saying and what the doctor thinks. But since 1991, most doctors have been up against the science. Now, when guidelines came along and changed the nature of health from healthcare to health services run by managers, the message was that, well, this was going to improve things because we were going to bring in entrepreneurs. What we've done is we've brought in bureaucrats, but the idea was these people were going to be open to innovation. They were going to bring private business into the system, and everything was going to work much better for patients and doctors than they had done before. They were going to be disruptive in a good sense. They were going to lead teams forward. They were going to tolerate risks. They were going to help people embrace risks, and they were going to be assertive. In fact, what's happened here is just the opposite. We've ended up with a world where, and probably the right word here is not entrefouer, this is a made-up French word for risk avoidance. Probably the word here should be just manager. It's a hostile environment for doctors and patients. It's a world where people keep to processes, and it's a world run by bureaucrats rather than entrepreneurs. It's a risk-intolerant world where managers benchmark and audit rather than encourage people to embrace risk, which you have to do if you're going to manage the problems people bring to you, rather than the services we bring to them by telling them they need to have their cholesterol levels checked or their peak flow rates checked or whatever. And as you see in the bottom left corner, the question about leadership is a moot point. This has come to a head in the UK recently, and I'm sure in most countries around the world, where if anything goes wrong, this has been criminalized, that it's doctors who are in the firing line rather than the system or the management or people going back and looking at just what's going wrong. And there's a good reason for this, as I'm hoping to bring out, but I just want to take it a step further, which is that as of 1990, because controlled trials only see a primary endpoint, the drug working, and don't see its harms, it helps the pharmaceutical industry transform their drugs into brands. Previously, they had brand names for on-patent drugs, but these brands became a whole new thing. They became sacraments. They could do no wrong. Things couldn't go wrong on them. You became a believer in these drugs. At the same time, other things began changing. The consequences for all of us are ones that I think we can see these days, which is rather than selves living in communities the way we had been before, the fracturing of our lives up into processes that can all be algorithmatized has created a world where there's a focus on our identity. This is a brand that needs to be managed in a way that we didn't have to do before. It's a world where we're now seeing epidemics of neurodiversity and epidemics of gender fluidity and a concentration on identity politics in a way that we didn't have before. This is intrinsically linked into Neo-Medicalism and can be seen most clearly in the health domain. And it can be seen most clearly in the health domain when something goes wrong on a drug. If you have a child or a partner or a parent who gets an SSRI and they become suicidal and kill themselves, or any other drug and something goes wrong, when you come along to the managers of our health services these days, you'll meet decent people who listen to you and try and check what's happened, but you walk out of the room mystified as to what has actually happened to your loved one, because the managers are focusing on the processes. Did person X communicate with person Y? Did they check through the checklist of things that they should have checked through? And they will have done so. And the services will be saying to you that, well, from our point of view, everybody who should have contacted anyone else contacted all the people they should have contacted and checked all the boxes they should have checked. So we did a great job. You walk out mystified as to what has happened. And what's going on here was caught in the case of the Guildford Four, which is 4 innocent Irish people who were locked up after a pub bombing in England in 1974 had killed people. It became clear fairly quickly that they were innocent, and a lot of English people put a lot of work into trying to ensure that they got out of jail. And they were blocked by the legal system, where the Chief Justice in the UK at the time, Thomas Denning, said that if their story is right, it's such an appalling vista, it cannot be. Wrongfully convicted prisoners should stay in jail rather than be freed and risk a loss of public confidence in the law. It's the same if anyone is injured on our treatments these days. The services don't have a box for drug or device or service-induced injury, because if they had a box for that in the root cause processes that they undergo when things go wrong, if they had a box for that, they'd have to have processes in place to manage that, processes that would recognize that part of the reason we've had harms is that the guidelines are based on fake news and we're not alerted to the risk of harms, and we've got to try and reverse that. Now, having a box like that and the processes that would go with it is above the pay grade of a the managers of any of our health services these days. It's above the pay grade of the politicians. The Secretary of State for Health in the UK, it's above his pay grade too. I know because I've written to all the ministers of health around the place here and drawn their attention to this. And while chief medical officers tell me we can see what's going on, they equally say there's nothing we can do about it. So, how do we solve the problem? Well, here's a wonderful cartoon of God giving guidelines some 3,000 years ago, and then recognizing this is not the way forward. Guidelines are just not the way forward. This will produce religious services rather than religious care. I'm going to have to come down to earth and show you guys how to do it properly. Well, we know that this particular experiment didn't work out all that well, and perhaps that's the reason why we're not terribly keen to engage in it since. But engage in it we must. And key to the engagement is here on this slide, which shows the execution of Walter Raleigh in 1618. Raleigh is executed on the basis of hearsay. He's accused of collaborating with Spain by people who do not come into court to be cross-examined. And recognizing the injustice of this afterwards, the UK legal system and legal systems worldwide changed to say we will not admit hearsay evidence. We'll admit randomized controlled trials, even though no one can be brought into court to be cross-examined, because we put this rule in place at a time when the patients or the doctors who have been in trials could be brought into court to be cross-examined. Now, when the doctors who appear to be the authors of these trials aren't the authors, when we know that a lot of the patients in these trials didn't exist, we still regard randomized controlled trials as not subject to the hearsay rule. When a harm happens on a drug and a doctor reports it to the regulator, what the regulator does is to make sure there are no names on the report, and they file the report away where it will stay forever, accompanying thousands of other reports of the same problem. And they're all regarded as anecdotes and hearsay. To change this, we have to have a system where you report to companies, probably rather than regulators, or have publications in journals with the name of the patient and the doctor attached to them, indicating a willingness to be brought into court to be cross-examined. Because if an injury happens to me or any of you, and you go into court to try and get justice, at the moment, if you say, well, I know that the regulator has thousands of other reports of this problem, the pharmaceutical company will say, hearsay, Your Honour, and the case will be thrown out. But if it's a situation that I can call on others to come into court to be cross-examined, which is how we establish cause and effect in the medical domain, which is how we establish it every day of the week when a doctor or a patient decides a drug isn't working for them. It's not through a controlled trial, it's an assessment of what's the most likely thing that's happening here, whether this drug is working or not. That's the critical factor. Our names, which are anonymous at the moment, they've been removed. We are invisible as doctors and patients, need to be brought back into the frame, even at the risk of execution or crucifixion. There is a slightly easier way out than execution, and Donald Trump has helped us with this in response to a school shooting in the United States when he said, what we need in these schools is a good guy with a gun. People were horrified at this and said, look, this can't be a good idea. But stumped by the follow-up point, which is, well, if a good guy with a gun isn't a good idea in a school, why do we have good guys outside the White House? Guns work. But we still feel that even though things work, multiplying them up too much and letting them leak into places that they shouldn't be probably isn't a great idea. And it's exactly the same thing with drugs. We've got things that work, but we've let them leak into places they shouldn't be, and we've multiplied them up too much. And that's what's leading to an increasing problem. And this is true of all techniques which are leading to the global climate crisis that we have now. In the case of techniques, they're all based on an algorithm. If X, then Y. In the case of arms, like guns, the person who's got the most efficient technique always wins. So this creates an arms race that it's difficult to get out of until the nuclear bomb, until we produced a technique that was so efficient that we couldn't use it. There is a limit to efficacy. And the other aspect to all this is that techniques are amoral. Whether they enhance or diminish us is down to us. It's down to a human judgment call. And this is the difference between healthcare and health services. But we've reached a nuclear moment in health. Life expectancy in the United States for the last few years, in the UK for the last 2 years, and in the developed world generally, is now either stalled or falling. People are unclear why this is happening. One of the things that, well, the key reason, I believe, is that drug-induced death is probably now the leading cause of death in community settings. It's the third leading cause of death in hospital settings. We also know that if you reduce the number of drugs that people are on from 10 or more down to 5 or less, that you increase their life expectancy, that you reduce the rate they go into hospital at, and that you improve their quality of life. But compared to the 1980s, when people were on an average just one drug, and even then only for a few weeks or a few months at most, 40% of people over the age of 45 are now on 3 or more drugs. 40% of people over the age of 65 are on 5 or more drugs. Now, there's a bunch of people over the age of 65 who are on no drugs. This means that the normative drug burden most people have is 7 drugs when you're over the age of 65. The side effects of drugs are things we think of as being rare, like the limbless babies from thalidomide, or the lowered white cell counts on a range of different drugs. These are rare things that affect a few people. That's the world that was in the 1960s. The world we have now is that the commonest cause of a hemorrhage is likely to stem from the 9 or 10 drugs you're on. The commonest cause of a fall or a fracture is going to stem from the 9 or 10 drugs you're on. The commonest cause of a whole range of problems, like you are more likely to end up being hospitalized because of the antidepressant you're taking than because of the depression you're given it for, or because of the diabetes treatments you're on rather than the type 2 diabetes you have. This is the world we're now in. We've reached a limit to efficacy. In order to put this right, we're going to have to return to conversations between people working in health. Well, we're going to have to return to healthcare, which is conversations between people, those working in healthcare and the people who bring problems to them. And we're going to have to say, well, look, there's all sorts of things we can do that may be helpful, but there has to be a limit to the number of things we do at any one time, because when we try to do more, we end up giving you less. We end up giving you problems. And this brings me to the final slide, which is that algorithms are from Mars and magic is from Venus. There's been a clash in Western civilization, and probably worldwide civilizations from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, which saw reason and rationality on one side and magic on the other. And civilization was a triumph of reason over magic. And this was a great idea and right to a great extent, except the kind of reason we're now talking about is algorithmic reason. There's an intelligibility behind every algorithm. It works. And this intelligibility, this working, can be capitalized. People can make money out of it. Medicine, however, shows that there's a limit to that. It's a world where it involves an irreducible element of magic. We're bringing good out of the use of a poison. This does not compute for philosophers or insurers or managers, but it's an inescapable aspect of medicine that we've neglected. It's going to involve courage and judgment and discretion. This, to my mind, means it's probably going to involve women leading the way forward rather than men. Thank you.